That's right. We have hope here. This is the first edition of the Hope One Show every day here at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, Lord willing. We're going to be here with a new idea that will give you hope during this difficult time. And there's probably nobody better that I know who can talk about the issue of bringing hope to parents than my friend Natasha Crain. Natasha has done some wonderful work on this issue. She's obviously a parent herself. She's written a number of books like Keeping God on Your Side, also talking to your kids about God. And the brand new book that'll come out tomorrow is talking to your kids about Jesus. But I want to bring Natasha on right now because, Natasha, there are so many people that are stressed right now regarding the coronavirus situation. They've got kids at home. Suddenly they're home. They were at school. Now they're home. And parents who typically are working themselves don't know what to do with them. So I want to get your insights on that as we get into this situation. But tell us a little bit about your situation at home right now. What's going on with your current lockdown status?
Yeah, well, we have 3 kids. We have boy-girl twins who are 11 and in 5th grade. And then we also have a 9-year-old daughter who's in 3rd grade. And normally they go to private Christian school, but like most schools in the country, our school closed. And so they're now home. But we're very blessed because our school is one of the schools that are actually giving us the things to do. So we have instruction. They're doing Zoom classes each day. And that's just been a real blessing because I know a lot of parents right now are just kind of waiting for instruction for their schools, or sometimes their schools aren't planning to give them any instruction the rest of the year. So from that perspective, we're definitely blessed to have them at home and have some educational things for them to do.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Jorge, I'm still hearing a lot of background noise as if there's an open mic somewhere. I don't know what that is, but if that could be shut off, that would be helpful. All right.
Yeah, I'll fix it in a minute.
Okay, you guys, there's noise now. Yeah, you're saying light scratchy noise. Okay, hey, we have hope. We're going to get it fixed. Jorge is like doing all this himself. It takes a while to make all this stuff work. But so, Natasha, you got 3 kids at home. And if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your husband, too, because your husband's doing some amazing work right now. And it's creating some stress in your life and his life. Tell everybody what he does and what you have to do every day when he comes home.
Yeah, well, he is the chief operating officer of the Orange County Rescue Mission. So if you're not familiar with a rescue mission, it's basically a transitional living program for people who are formerly homeless. So they come in for 18 to 24 months and they get all kinds of life skills training and job skills training. They get help getting clean if that's part of the issues that they're having. And it's a gospel rescue mission, which specifically means that it's a faith-based program. So he's in charge of these programs. They have multiple campuses and hundreds of people who are living there. And if you're managing a live-in type of facility during a time like this, it's extremely stressful because there are so many things to consider to make sure that people are safe, that food is still coming, that you know what to do in any kind of occurrence that's going to happen with this. So he is dealing with a lot of stress and working a lot of hours right now. He's considered essential services, so he's still going to work. But every day when he comes home, he makes sure that he takes a shower, he changes clothes, and we have a basement. And so we're actually starting to quarantine him there so that he can stay removed from us, even though there's no one currently at the program who is tested positive. But it is enormously stressful. And I know that there are people in far more stressful situations too, who are actually doctors and emergency rooms and things like that. But we're just one of many families out there that have somebody who's still working outside the home and facing a likely exposure to coronavirus at some point. So I absolutely understand what that's like for the other parents out there who have somebody who's still going out each day.
Well, we want to, as Christians and just as citizens, we want to thank all those people that are doing the kind of work that even keep the economy moving through difficult times. Not only the economy, but obviously medicine. These people are working, doctors, nurses, EMTs. You've also just got truckers and people working at the grocery store that feed us every day or provide the resources that we could feed ourselves. And those guys are doing heroic work. And so we want to thank those people when you see them. Thank them for the work they're doing because they are putting themselves at some risk of getting the virus themselves. Now, Natasha, what have you personally found to be the most difficult aspect of parenting during this lockdown period?
I think for sure it's been trying to get work done from home. I think that a lot of parents can probably empathize with that. If you were working outside the home and you have come home, or maybe you're working from home before and now your kids are at home, it's really hard to get a lot done. And I think it's one thing if you are already in that kind of mode, maybe you're a homeschooler, for example, and you're used to maybe doing your work if you have other work that you do and schooling your kids, but it's that change, and that's very abrupt change that makes it so difficult. But because all of a sudden your kids are there, they need you, maybe they have assignments and they're going to need your help with them, or maybe they have nothing to do and the siblings start to fight and those kinds of things. So it's really hard to just get stuff done that you otherwise would have been getting done. And that's been the biggest challenge for me, and I'm sure for a lot of parents out there.
Now, you obviously have your own experience. Everyone has their own experience with this lockdown period, but you actually took the initiative of surveying people in your realm, in the people that follow you, and you have a significant following. You were surveying parents, and you did so on Facebook. What kind of findings did you get from this survey, these parents who are in the situation that we're all in right now?
Yeah, so my background professionally is actually in market research. And so when I had a personal interest in finding out how parents were handling this whole lockdown situation, and I had the professional background to do it. So I decided I was going to do this survey. And so I put this out through Facebook last week, and we got almost 400 responses. And it was really just fascinating to see what people had to say. And honestly, the biggest reason that I wanted to do is because I kept seeing in my Facebook feed these ads for everything imaginable, where everyone was just assuming that I'm sitting around looking for more things to do. Everything was like, sign up for this class and do this program and, buy this soccer ball that your kids can do in front of the TV. And all these things are great, but I was starting to feel like, gosh, am I doing something wrong? Because I'm just trying to survive right now. And so I decided to do this survey, and I wanted to collect some data on, what the family structure was before, are they homeschoolers, or do their kids go to public school, things like that. But primarily I wanted to measure 3 different emotional factors, and that was added fear, added stress, or added boredom relative to before this pandemic. And just to highlight a few of the findings that I thought were so interesting, overwhelmingly, I think it was about 62% of families reported that they feel things are going quite well or even excellent at home right now. So that was a very positive things that families are starting to they're starting to feel like they're getting into a groove and things are going to be okay. About a third said that they feel like it's just okay. And a small percent, only about 5%, said that things aren't going very well, or that they feel that they're really struggling with this. So parents were fairly positive for the most part. But that said, also a clear majority said that the pandemic has made them at least somewhat more fearful and somewhat more stressed. So those numbers are between 60 and 70% of parents. And I think that that's very normal. And that was across the board, whether they had kids who were home before, whether they had a new work situation. That was just across the board that in general people were feeling those feelings. But the majority of people say that they are not feeling any more bored than they were before the pandemic. And most of their kids are not either. And so I thought that was really interesting, because it seemed that there was this kind of assumption in all these ads that I had seen that we're all just sitting around looking for stuff to do. But overwhelmingly, that was not how parents were feeling. But one last thing that I thought was really interesting was about the stress levels. And like I said, I have a background in market research and statistics. And so I actually did some statistic modeling on the data that came in to see what were the factors that were driving stress levels of parents. So for those parents who reported increasing levels of stress significantly, what was it that drove that? Was it their changing work situation? Was it school situation? And what you can see is it's very clearly related to newly having to educate your kids at home. That was absolutely what drove it. It had nothing to do with a work situation. I also asked a question, do you have a family member who works in essential services right now? Even that was not a statistically significant contributor to people's stress level. It was very much about my kid is now at home. And within that group of my kid is now at home, by far the greatest stress was my kid's now at home and I don't yet have any instruction from my school. So that contributed to stress, but not to boredom, which I thought was a really interesting distinction. Parents are feeling like, what am I supposed to do here? But they're not necessarily feeling bored. And by far, the group that is still thriving the most were the people who were homeschooling before this happened, because they don't have any kind of educational changes that they're working through right now. So it was a really interesting survey, and I appreciated seeing that there were a lot of parents who were saying that, hey, things are going pretty well. We're making it. We're not sitting around feeling totally bored, and we're making the best of our time.
Okay, for those of us who are watching right now who are going, okay, but I am feeling significantly more stressed about that, what kind of advice and hope can you give them in this situation, Natasha?
Yeah, I would say lower your expectations. And I'm the last person in the world to tell anyone to lower their expectations normally. I spent a lot of time writing and speaking about how, as parents, collectively Christian parents, we need to be raising the bar for understanding what our kids can really learn about their faith and deepen their faith. So I'm constantly telling people to raise the bar. But in this case, we're in a crisis situation. This is totally different. And this is not the time to feel like you have to have all the perfectly color-coded charts and that you have to, have all of those programs and all of those different activities that you see advertised on Facebook. This is not the time for that. Give yourself grace, give your kids grace, and know that even the things that haven't changed so much, maybe your kids are, they were behaving better before and now they're actually behaving worse. That's going to happen, because your kids are processing a lot right now, just as we are. So even the status quo is changing for us. And so I think it's just important that we lower our expectations of ourselves and even our kids right now, so that we can kind of settle into this new normal and don't feel like you have to solve everything in one fell swoop. A little bit at a time, day by day, go slow.
Yeah, you don't have to be super mom or super dad. And I'm glad you brought up the word grace, because that's often overlooked. And in Christianity, friends, you don't achieve your salvation, you receive your salvation. And it's all grace, it's all God's gift to us. So don't feel like you have to do all this yourself. When it comes to salvation, you don't do anything. You just accept it. Now, when it comes to parenting, obviously you have to work. But as Natasha said, give yourself some grace and your kids some grace during this difficult period. There's going to be times when you're not going to have the perfect household. In fact, none of us have the perfect household. If you knew what went on in all of our households, you go, these people are Christian? Yeah, there's difficulty, right? I love the title of your new book is Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. And we were joking before the break that we might want to call this Talking with Your Kids About Jesus When You Want to Shoot Them. I mean, because the stress level just goes up when you've got, first of all, you're confined and you can't do what you normally do. Secondly, you're at home, they're at home, and normally that's not the case all day. And then you got to figure out a way, okay, we have financial trouble, with financial stresses, we may have medical stresses, we've got now education stresses. You can't do it all. You've got to pick your spots. You've got to give yourself some grace. You've got to lower the expectations. Now, in this new book, and we're not here to sell your book today, but it is interesting that your book, Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, in the introduction, you talk about reading a blog once that changed your perspective on what we're talking about here, that you sometimes have to lower your expectations and you've got to do things in increments. Explain what that principle is right here, Natasha.
Yeah, so I have always had trouble keeping a tidy house. It's just one of those things, we always have homework scattered everywhere and pencils on seat cushions, stacks of mail. And I've always looked at other people's houses and thought, how do they do this? Do they know something that I don't? Because it seems like they are keeping a much cleaner house than I am. Mm-hmm. And one day when I was on Facebook, I saw this article that was being promoted, and it was called 5 Things That Tidy People Don't Do. So this really piqued my interest, given that this is a struggle for me. And I clicked over, and it was a fascinating article because one of the points was so relevant, I think, for when we're talking about faith conversations. And it said that one thing that tidy people don't do is they don't act like a slob all day and then think that they're going to clean everything up in one fell swoop later on. What they do is they develop these tiny, drastic kind of daily ongoing habits. And they called this low grade tidying. They said tidy people are in this constant state of low grade tidying. And I just love that analogy because I think it's so true, both for cleaning. It has helped me a little bit with keeping the house clean, but also I think it's a great analogy for faith conversations. I would never want somebody to pick up a book like mine and feel like, oh my gosh, there's just so much to do here. We're going to have to clear out the calendar for a week, have a family retreat to learn about why we should believe that Jesus was who he said he was. It's not like that. What we want to do as parents is we want to get equipped with the understanding that we need to have the conversations with our kids over time so that we're constantly tidying up their understanding of their faith, that little by little being able to have these conversations day in and day out and make it a lifestyle, make it something that we're doing on an ongoing basis. That makes it far less overwhelming than feeling like it is a one fell swoop type of deep cleaning, because we all know how that feels to have to really dig in and do something at that kind of level. So I think that especially at a time like this, when everyone's feeling so stressed, and we talked about giving ourselves grace, part of that is just understanding that, if yes, this is a great time to have conversations with your kids about Christianity. That doesn't mean you're going to have to do it perfectly. It doesn't mean you're going to have to set aside now 3 hours a day. It doesn't mean that everything changes immediately because we're on quarantine. It means, okay, let's start to be a little bit more mindful about this. This is a great time to be more intentional, but little bits by little bits, let's have low grade tidying with these faith conversations.
By the way, for those of you watching either on YouTube or Facebook, you can type your question into the chat column there, and in a little bit later in the program, we'll get to your questions. So if you can do that, do it now, and we hope to get to your question a little bit later. But let's talk about that tidying aspect now. Look, the president has just said that pretty much we're all going to be shut down for the month of April. We're not going anywhere except for essentials like going to the grocery store, or going to the pharmacy, or those kind of things. So we are going to be home for a while. And you talk about faith conversations. All your books, Natasha, talk about how you can have faith conversations with your kids, which are so important. How can you use this tidying as you go principle to do that in a non-awkward way with your kids? You know what I'm saying, Natasha? I mean, sometimes, you get the Bible out with your kids and they start rolling their eyes. You're like, oh, come on, Mom. Come on, Dad. How can we have faith conversations, but not add to the current level of stress now in our homes?
That's a really good question. And it's such a true point too about the awkwardness of it sometimes. It does feel, I think some parents feel like if they're going to have faith conversations, it means that everyone's going to gather very solemnly around the table, and, Dad opens the Bible, like you said, and everyone gets very serious. And it doesn't have to be like that. But I will say that if you have this sense of awkwardness, or maybe you haven't been doing any of this before, it's well worth just telling your kids, hey, you know what? We really should be talking more about our faith in our home. And so I'm going to be trying to do a better job as mom or dad to bring up some of these things. So I just wanted you to know, if we start talking about this stuff, that's what's going on. There's nothing weird happening, or, there's nothing you don't know about. I just feel like we need to talk about this more. And honestly, I've done that with my own kids when we've gone through times where, maybe there are a few weeks where things got so hectic and we just, we didn't have as much time as usual. And then I just pull it back and say, hey guys, we've not been doing enough of this, so we're going to do it more. So I think that's a good way of taking the awkwardness away, because your kids at least know that it's coming. And then once you kind of establish that, pick something small, because again, in the heart of low grade tidying, if you sit down and you're like, okay, now we want to talk about this more, we're going to spend an hour a day doing it, most kids are not going to sit through that. So even give it a time frame. So when we do our Bible studies with our kids, we tell them this is half an hour, and they know going into it what to expect. And that has helped a lot, especially with the younger one who's a little more fidgety, to know this is the parameter on what we're talking about. We're going to sit down. And what we do, we just read a chapter from the Bible in that time, and we get as far as we can talking about it. And then we ask them to write in a notebook 3 points that they took away from that. So that's just something simple that you can do. Another thing that you can do is, if you really haven't talked a lot about this stuff with your kids or had some of these more intentional conversations, have a questions night or questions dinner, and just ask your kids, what kind of questions are top of mind for you? What, especially with the coronavirus, this is a very kind of situationally relevant thing right now, where you can say, a lot of people have more questions about God during a time like this. What are some of the questions you think people start asking? And that also kind of takes it away from the pressure on your kids. Like, what questions do you have about God right now? Right? Instead of that, you're actually phrasing it in terms of, what do you think people would start asking about God? Who God is and why he does these things. And so having them bring to you their questions then gives you a starting point, because if they bring up 3 or 4 questions, there you go. Now the next night you say, hey, one of the questions that you asked us tonight was about this. Let's talk about that a little bit before bedtime, for example. One other thing that I haven't actually done yet, but I'm working on getting started, is what I'm going to call a learning opportunities menu. So especially for older kids, I think that this will be good. But I'm just coming up with a whole bunch of different things that I would like for them to learn. And this is child specific. So my son's very engineering and STEM oriented. So I want to give him things like, learn something about JavaScript, for example, or for my daughter, learn how to label all the countries in Europe, whatever it might be. But you can throw things in there related to faith. So one of those things might be, find out one piece of evidence for God's existence, or one piece of evidence for the resurrection. And so for any of the things that they do from this list, they'll get points, and those points can be redeemable for different either opportunities or privileges, or it could even be for money, whatever you decide. But that's also a good way of kind of getting them motivated and giving them a reward system for the kinds of things they're going to learn. Because I know for those of you who have kids at home who don't have any instruction from school, and the school's basically setting them free, I know it's not as easy as saying, oh, but we're still going to school. We're still going to make sure that you guys are doing X, Y, and Z. And your kids are going to say, yeah, but we don't have to do school, and that can become a fight. But if you kind of change a little bit and say, okay, but here are learning opportunities, and you're going to earn points, and you can get these kinds of privileges from it, then it starts to look a lot different. So it's just kind of another way of looking at it.
I like those ideas. I heard an idea from Oz Guinness once that made a lot of sense to me. He called it spot the lie. I don't know if you've heard of this, Natasha, but he was saying, let's just say you're having a casual night and you decide to turn on the TV, which sometimes can be a mistake, as you know. You're watching something and you know that something that is false comes up on the screen. It could be a commercial. It could be something going on in the show. It could be a worldview issue. Like, for example, say you're watching a show and there's premarital sex and there's never any negative consequences. Everybody's happy. Everybody's good. You can stop with your child and say, okay, what's being taught here and what's the lie in it? And just see what they say, see if they get it. Or you're watching a program that talks about how that everything is just caused by nature. There's no immaterial realm. There's no supernatural. Okay, what is being taught in this program or in this movie? And why is that a lie? You're not breaking out the Bible and saying, okay, let's have a moral lesson here, kids. Let's just see if they can spot what's being taught first and see if they know whether what's being taught here is a lie or not. So spot the lie is an easy way of actually teaching these lessons without it being awkward, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good example of why it's so important for parents to be equipped with the understanding of all these things and the challenges in today's world. Because once you're equipped yourself and you understand the types of challenges, and even when they're very sort of stealth types of challenges, where it's just this, I think it's Nancy Pearcey who calls it a creeping secularism. When you start to see those things, those opportunities are everywhere to have these conversations with your kids without having to sit down and have the super formal conversation. Like you said, any movie, any kids TV show, any Disney show, anything is going to tell you, for example, follow your heart. Well, really? Because the heart's deceitful of all things. Let's talk about what kind of worldview that represents. But that could easily just go right past you if you haven't really immersed yourself in some of those things. So that's where the parents' background, the parents' knowledge actually can be really helpful in just kind of spotting those opportunities that otherwise there might not be there.
That's a great one, Natasha. Follow your heart. In fact, I think I heard Tim Keller talking about that. Is that from the? Now, I don't have daughters, and my sons are older now. We've never seen the movie Frozen, but is Frozen all about following your heart? Is that what it's about?
It's been a while since I have seen Frozen, but I almost every movie that you can find will have some message. Yeah. We just saw The Addams Family, for example, and we look at every movie before we see it as a family. And, we had seen just the basic thing. Okay, it doesn't have any violence. It doesn't have any kind of And okay, fine, this looks okay. So we watched this movie, and I got to tell you, I was horrified by the end. I couldn't even believe it. I was thinking of the old show, The Addams Family, like my parents used to watch when I was a kid. And it was nothing like that. I mean, the whole movie was so disrespectful toward parents. The whole idea was that your identity is whoever you want it to be. And one girl, she wanted to be more like the other family. The other one wanted to be more like this other family. The parents were always wrong. Anything traditional was wrong. I mean, it could not have been a bigger attack on a traditional kind of family or any kind of authority. I was really shocked. So, if as a parent you're up for those kinds of conversations, that's actually a good learning movie to watch with your kids, because we asked our kids afterwards, what do you think about that? What was it communicating about the parents? What was it communicating about your identity? That ultimately your identity is whoever you want to be, or is it who God wants you to be? Is there ultimately a creator and designer of life, or is it just you and whatever you want to do? Who's that authority? So it made for a great conversation. But yeah, I mean, this whole thing about who you are, your identity, that can be found in pretty much every movie that's out there right now.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, that actually the bad movies can actually be more instructive than some of the good movies. The thing you don't want to do is not talk about them after it happens. If you're embarrassed, that's the time when you ought to talk about it. That's the time when you ought to say, hey, let's talk about this. What was taught here? What do you think about that? In fact, I remember this from Josh McDowell. This had to go back 30 or 40 years ago, probably 35 years ago, when Sean was just a 5-year-old. He said he would take Sean McDowell, down to the park in a bad part of town, see all sorts of graffiti on the wall, and say, son, you see that? See what that says? What does that mean? Let me tell you what it means, right? He would not want Sean learning this stuff from his friends. He would want to be the first to tell them. And my wife, Stephanie, she takes that same approach. She talked about sex with the kids from the very beginning and explained it completely. I mean, we both did. And we didn't get all worried about these conversations. We just talked about them like we talk about anything else, because if you freak out with your kids over these, what you consider sensitive conversations, are they ever going to come back to you and ask you for your advice when they actually want to get involved in this kind of thing, or thinking of getting it? No, they're going to go to their friends. They're not going to come to you. So it's very important that I think you talk to your kids about all these issues right up front.
I think it's a credibility thing too. If your kids know you're the one who's bringing the issue to you, like you're talking about with Josh and Sean McDowell in that example, they know that you're not hiding anything, right?
That's right. Yeah.
It's it reminds me of, so around New Year's, the Starbucks bias, they had this New Year's resolution goal type of board, and it asked people to post any kind of inspiration, that they wanted to share for others. And I took a picture of it when I was at the Starbucks that day, because I just couldn't believe the kinds of inspiration that people felt was inspirational. All these things like, be your best you and live your best life now, and all these kinds of things. So I took a picture of it and I brought it home and I read them to my kids over dinner, and we just talked about them. And is this inspirational? Should it be inspirational? And I also asked them questions like, is this consistent or inconsistent with a Christian worldview? And I think that's a very helpful conversation to have with your kids about a lot of things, because things can be consistent with a Christian worldview even if they're not explicitly Christian, and we want our kids to be able to see that. And then there are other things that are inconsistent with the Christian worldview that, no matter where that source is, no matter what is coming from, this does not jive with what we believe. And that's not even getting to, is Christianity true or not? It's just understanding from a worldview perspective, would this piece of the puzzle fit in with a Christian worldview? And so it's a helpful conversation to have, because kids need to understand too that not everything is opposed to Christianity. Some things that are not necessarily found in the Bible, they're not necessarily going to contradict anything within Christianity, but some other things will. That's a common question I ask my kids about consistency.
By the way, we're going to go to your questions here in about 5 minutes. So if you have questions, write them in on the feed, the comment chat area in YouTube or in Facebook. And we'll get to them as soon as we can here. I have a couple more questions for Natasha. By the way, her website, natashacrain.com, natashacrain.com. You'll see Natasha's blog there and her books. And as I say, she's got a new book coming out tomorrow called Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. And these are 30 conversations every Christian parent must have. She also has Talking with Your Kids About God. That was a couple of years ago, but these are 30 conversations every Christian parent must have. And then her first book was called Keeping Your Kids on God's Side. I got that right? I don't have the book in front of me. It's up on my shelf here somewhere, Natasha.
You got
but
it.
Anyway,
Keep your kids on God's side.
So those are great resources, especially right now. And as Natasha said earlier, parents, you don't have to be super mom or super dad. Just move the ball forward every day a little bit. Just have these conversations naturally with your kids. And look, it's been shown that you might not think this is true. Even if you have teenagers, you might not think it's true, but it is true that you still are the most influential person in your child's life. And so you want to influence your kid more than the world influences your kid, but you have to be proactive to do it. You just can't think it's going to seep into their minds by osmosis. You have to make a positive effort to do it. Again, you don't have to do it all in one day. You just got to be, how did you put it, Natasha? Tidy in an intermittent way or in a regular way. What did you call it?
Low grade tidy.
Low grade tidy. You just got to be low grade tidy continually. Low grade tidy. We're not talking about keeping your house tidy, but that would be good too. We just talk about keeping the minds of your kids tidy. And so you can just do this in a low grade way every day, and you'll be moving the ball forward with them. What other things do you want to talk about that parents might be able to do with their kids during this period, this lockdown period? Is there any other advice you want to give them, Natasha?
Well, I was going to say Easter, it comes up very soon.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a good time too, where you're not going to blow your kids away if you suddenly start talking about faith more, because they might expect, okay, Easter's coming, so we're going to talk about this. But, we talked a little bit about older kids and doing things like learning opportunities. But with younger kids, it's really easy to do something like an Easter craft right now, right? You could do something making a cross or an empty tomb. You can find all these things online on Pinterest and things like that. But as you're doing the activity, it's a great non-intimidating time to just kind of ask some questions like, why do you think Easter is so important to Christians? Like, why does it really matter if Jesus was raised from the dead? Do you think we would still be Christians if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead? And start to just kind of get them thinking about these things. Whereas if you weren't doing that kind of craft or activity, maybe your kid just kind of shuts down. We've all seen that happen with our kids at all kinds of different ages. When you ask them a question point blank, maybe they don't want to answer and they're like, I don't know, whatever, it doesn't matter. But if you're just kind of doing something with them, that can be a good way, especially with the younger set, to have some of these conversations and get them talking about it. So Easter makes a really great opportunity to have those topics of conversation around Jesus' death. Why did he need to die for our sins? What does it mean that he was raised from the dead? Is it maybe a symbolic thing as your kids get older and have those conversations? And so, there's just a lot you can talk about around Easter that is really relevant right now specifically.
Now, this show, of course, is all about hope. That's why we're calling it Hope One. What do you think kids most need to know in order to understand that their hope is in Jesus through all this crisis we're going through right now? What do they need to know? What's the bottom line about that, Natasha?
Well, a couple of things. I think first and foremost, and as parents, I think we skip over this way too much, but our kids need to understand that our hope is in Jesus if and only if Christianity is true. So we want them to understand this isn't a wishful kind of thinking. This isn't I really hope, that things are going to go well for me after I die because my hope is in Jesus. We want them to understand this is a matter of truth and pursuing truth. I told my twins when they were 6 years old, I remember this conversation. I said, I do not want you to grow up and say that the reason that you believe in Jesus is because I did as your mom. I want you to know that God has given us lots of evidence and there are ways to pursue the truth, and that I'm going to teach you that over time. And I think that that's a really huge starting point for a kid, just to understand that hope is well justified hope when we're talking about it in this way. The second thing is, I think our kids need to understand what the truth test is for Christianity. Ultimately, okay, fine. And my hope is in Jesus if it's true. How do I know that it's true? And so this is where we point them back to 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul says that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. I tell my kids this all the time. It just doesn't matter. Nothing about Christianity matters if Jesus wasn't actually raised from the dead. And so it doesn't, all these other questions that come up about, well, I don't know about this in the Bible or that in the Bible. Ultimately, it comes back to a question about the resurrection. And so I like to keep my kids very focused on that. And then, of course, that should lead us to say, okay, well, it is based on the resurrection. That's the truth test. But ultimately, how do we know that Jesus was from the dead. This is where we need to be able to give our kids some of this really good evidence for the resurrection. What is the historical evidence for the resurrection? How do we know that God exists? How can we be confident in these things? So in my mind, those are kind of the 3 steps. But at the end of the day, when our kids know that, yes, my hope is in Jesus, they also have to understand why that matters so much. And I've always said, and I know this sounds really a little bit depressing, but I've always said that I don't think kids can understand hope if they don't understand the hopelessness of this world if Christianity wasn't true. So I like to compare and contrast that and say, hey, if atheism's true, if there is no God, then this life is objectively meaningless and you're going to die, you're going into the ground, all this stuff with the coronavirus, you could die and that's going to be the end, and it was for nothing. That's why hope matters, because at a time like this, people start to really realize, okay, there has to be something more. There has to be something redeemable out of this. Of course, we don't want to just have the wishful thinking, but we do want our kids to understand that there's a big difference between hope that, is a little significant and hope that means everything in the world. And that's the hope of Christianity.
It is. And you can only have 2 things in life. You're going to have either hope or despair. And if Christianity is true, there's hope. If it's not, there's despair. And the beauty of Christianity is that it is true, and you can show that it's true. And I hope people who haven't accepted what Christ has done would do so. And even though you might feel inadequate as a parent, you might feel inadequate as someone who holds a job right now, you might feel inadequate in a lot of ways because of the crisis going on. At the end of all this, there still is hope. There's hope in Jesus, no matter what happens, whether you survive this or not. I want to say one thing, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow. And we're going to have several guests this week and into next week as well. I'll tell you about them a little bit later. But if you just watch the media, you would think the world was ending. And the media has a lot of stories that talk about people dying, and there are people dying. It's a tragedy, and every death's a tragedy. However, for every story you see someone dying, there are 99 stories about people recovering that you'll never read, because the media rarely covers those. They cover just the people dying. The death rate on this is probably less than 1%. Officially, it's about 1.8 today. But that's because there's a lot of people who have it that we don't even know they have it, and they're not going to die. So it's probably less than 1%. So for every story you hear about someone perishing, which is a tragedy, we all admit that, there's 99 stories that are never written about people recovering. So what do we do as Christians? We obey what the governing authorities tell us to do. We do the social distancing, and we do that until they say it's safe to resume our lives. And until then, what we're going to do here is try and bring you hope online. We can't be in your presence. That's why Natasha's here. Natasha can bring you hope to parenting. A little bit later on in this week, we'll have Craig Hazen on from Biola University. He's going to talk about how you can bring hope through prayer. In fact, he has a book called Fearless Prayer. On Thursday, we'll have Stephen Meyer and probably Doug Axe or another individual from the Discovery Institute to talk about viruses. What are viruses? Are they necessary? Why do they exist? Did God create viruses? Is God the author of evil? We're going to talk about that issue. We'll have Dr. Dan Eichenberg on again, the medical doctor who is treating coronavirus patients. He'll tell us more about that. We're also going to have Dr. Michael Heiser on. As you know, he is the guy that has written several amazing books that have kind of changed the paradigm for people on how they view the supernatural in the Bible. He's written the book Supernatural. He's written the book Unseen Realm. He's got a new book coming out on demons. He has a book on angels. We're going to talk about interpreting some of the Bible passages related to this. You can look at Psalm 91. You can look at Mark 11. You can look at John 15. You can look at many passages that deal with God protecting people and healing people. And what about that? So we're going to have him on. There's more coming. But let's go now to questions with Natasha, because I know you guys have a lot of questions. These are questions related to parenting. What kind of hope can we bring to the parent in this difficult time? So let me bring Jorge on. Jorge's been monitoring this and looking at the questions. What kind of questions do you have for Jorge? For Natasha. Jorge.
For Natasha, hey, well.
Jorge, you can answer too.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So we have one here, says, how can you initiate a gathering around the table, a conversation when you're gathering around the table, even though other family members are not true believers?
around the dinner table? Is that the question?
That's what the questioner asked.
Well, that's a question that comes up a lot when I do speaking events is how do you do these things when, you have one person in your house who maybe isn't a Christian? And it's a really hard question to answer actually, because it depends on how hostile to Christianity and to teaching kids about Christianity the person is. I know of some parents, for example, whose spouses are opposed to them talking about these things at all, and that's a very difficult situation, because then it's a question of, well, if I've said that I'm not going to be talking about this with kids, do I still go around them and talk to my kids anyway? Those are really hard questions. But in other cases, the spouse is open to having those conversations. And so I think in that case, it's a lot like it would be even if the spouse was a believer. You just don't have someone else to help lead the conversation. So if they're willing to have those conversations, make it a learning opportunity for your kids. I mean, your child is going to hear from the other parent's perspective anyway, so it's a great time for you to ask the questions and have your spouse to actually give their view and talk about, okay, well, here's why I believe what I do, and here, offer for your spouse to say, well, here's why I believe what I do. So I think, a lot of times I think that the Christian parent probably doesn't necessarily feel equipped to have that conversation, but at the same time, if you are listening to podcasts, watching shows like this, reading books, and so you can give some of those answers yourself, it does give you the opportunity to have that live, active conversation in front of your kids and with your kids. And I think that those are difficult conversations to have, but I think that they're very valuable for your kids to hear both sides. And it also, we talked about credibility. I also think that it shows a credibility that you're not just always sneaking off in the corner trying to have some conversation where your unbelieving spouse is not there saying something, but to have it out in the open and embrace questions so that everyone feels that they can say something.
I wonder too if the question that we like to ask, you could ask privately of your unbelieving spouse, and that is, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Because I think quite frequently the issue is not intellectual, it's emotional, it's volitional. They don't want it to be true because they think that God is going to somehow interfere with what they want to do. God's going to get in the way of their agenda. So it might be very very helpful to everybody to understand where the other person's coming from. Because if the person hesitates or says no to the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? The problem is not intellectual, it's moral, it's volitional. They don't want it to be true. And I think that can move the ball forward. At least everyone knows where we stand here. If the person brings up intellectual objections, well, there's answers to that, right? There's answers to these intellectual objections that can be investigated. But if the person is just volitionally resistant, they don't want it to be true, at least that's on the table. At least people understand where everyone's coming from. That's important.
Got another question here. It says, how do you explain evil and the goodness of God to a child during this time where they see relatives dying, even though, we're praying for them?
Yeah, it's very difficult. There's no question about it. And I think that, apologists often make this distinction between, talking about the philosophical and theological reasons that we can give for evil versus being there and grieving with someone in a time of grief. So if anybody needs comfort, they have a loved one dying, then first and foremost, we're being sad with them. Jesus wept when Lazarus died. And I think we have to remember that there is a sadness to the fact that sin is in this world. But ultimately, if we are Christians and we believe that Christianity is true, Jesus has overcome death. He has conquered, and that gives us the hope of eternal life. So it's interesting because with the coronavirus, there's no additional evil in the world compared to what there was before. We're just more aware of it. It's like God has just brought it front and center and put a spotlight on it. And so if our kids are asking those questions, they're great questions, but those questions existed before. The world has always had natural evils. The world has always had moral evil. And so it's a really good time to talk to our kids about, hey, we see these things in the world because of sin. The Bible tells us that that's why they're here. And that ultimately it's when we die, God has made it this way so that evil doesn't continue forever. If we lived forever, we would be stuck here in this world forever. And that's not what any of us wants. And that's something that I always come back to with my own kids. And I think it's helpful for them to understand, thank God death ultimately brings us toward that eternal life that God will redeem this world. And as far as, the more philosophical, theological aspect, why, viruses and how does this come into everything? That's a very question. I'm glad that Stephen Meyer is going to come on, because ultimately it is a question about your view on the age of the earth. Earth creationist is going to answer that question one way. Someone who's an old earth creationist or evolutionist is going to answer it a different way. So I'll leave that part of the other episode that you'll be doing later this week.
There is a podcast we just did a couple of days ago called Evil is a Powerful Argument for God. So the questioner, I'd recommend you listen to that podcast. It's the latest one on the Cross-Examined app. It's the latest one on the iTunes feed for I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So just go there. It turns out that evil is actually an argument for God. And there's a lot of assumptions you make when you say there's too much evil in the world, there can't be a good God. It actually backfires and shows you there is a God. But I'll just refer you to that podcast that we just recorded a couple of days ago.
It's very good. I got another question here. It says, what to say to a child who says, Daddy or Mommy, let me go out and play. You told me that God will protect me.
Well, okay. If you have taught your kids that God will protect you, I think that you have to have some serious clarification conversations. And this is actually, this is a little bit of a soapbox issue for me, because I feel like especially kids' books so greatly oversimplify theology that it becomes inaccurate a lot of times.
Right.
And there is this just predominant understand what the Bible does and doesn't promise. Because when people think that the Bible promises something it doesn't, and then they find that those so-called promises are broken, it very often leads them away from faith. And I have seen that play out over and over in the last few years. Of parents have contacted me, and now atheists who were Christians have emailed me and said various things. It's very clear they think that the Bible promised something that it doesn't actually promise. And this is a perfect example of that.
In fact, we're going to talk about that with Michael Heiser. I was just looking at an email from him. We may have him on Friday. If not, it'll be next week. I talked to him on the phone this morning about Psalm 91. Some of you are referencing Psalm 91 about God will protect you from the plague and all this. Well, it turns out that Jesus actually, when he's being tempted, is tempted by Satan, and who quotes Psalm 91. And Jesus says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. We'll unpack that with Michael Heiser, because a lot of people are trying to take Psalm 91 as if God is going to blanket protect them and they're never going to get sick or they're never going to fall or that's not what it means. So we'll save that for Michael Heiser. But I totally agree with you, Natasha, that sometimes this theology is so simplified. And when it's so simplified, when the theology doesn't come true, people just stop believing in God rather than realizing they had the wrong theology about God. Let's take one more if we can, Jorge. We're coming up on our hour.
Yeah, and this one is actually more related to apologetics than what's going on. But it says, it felt like a rod was removed from my insides when I came to Christ. I had a radical changes in my life. Does apologetics need to discuss more of the role of the Holy Spirit in bringing sinners to Christ?
Uh, I mean, yes, I guess I would say that there's a balance here. And I think that a lot of times you see Christians who kind of go on one end or the other of that. It's all this intellectual thing and, forget about the work of the Spirit. Or some Christians kind of tend to be more on the side of it's all work of the Spirit. We don't need any of this intellectual stuff. But in reality, the Bible brings those two things together. Of course, the Holy Spirit is active today. The Holy Spirit is given to all believers. And so from that perspective, there's no question that we need to look more to the work of the Spirit in our lives. And it's always a function of both the heart and the mind. And I think that's so important to understand, because a lot of times when I get kind of a hesitancy from parents in terms of apologetics, they say, yeah, but I'm really just concerned about my child's heart and how they feel and their love for the Lord. Our mind convicts our hearts. So the more convicted that we are in our minds that Christianity is absolutely true, regardless of how I feel on a given day, no matter how rocked I get by the coronavirus, ultimately our minds convict our hearts. These things are very much connected and work. So the Spirit moves through us. The Spirit is in us as believers. That's 100% true, but it's also 100% true that our minds and our hearts work together. And so that's how I think apologetics can be really helpful for a lot of people, is addressing that intellectual end. Even for people who maybe haven't encountered it already, when they get that grounding, I talked my husband at the rescue mission, we started an apologetics program there for the residents, because they might feel really close to Jesus while they're in a program like that, where they're confined and kind of in this small little version of society. But eventually they're going back out into the world and they're going to have to face a lot of temptations again and a lot of challenges. What happens if you don't feel God so much then? Well, that's when you kind of come back to, okay, but these are the good reasons I learned why Christianity is true. So that's a long answer, but really just to say that these things all work together. It's not one or the other. It's not the Spirit or apologetics. It's these things all together.
Natasha, tell people about your website, what they can find there, and just tell them a little bit about this new book. We'll have you on the podcast to talk more about the contents of this book, but tell them what they can get out of your podcast, or I'm sorry, your website, and also the book.
Yeah, so my website's just like my name, natashacrain.com, and I write a blog there, usually only once or twice a month right now, but you can get hundreds of articles that I've written that are there to equip Christian parents. And I also have a resources page, and so I have reading plans for parents based on all the books that I've read over the last few years as just a regular parent, getting up to speed in apologetics and what I found most helpful. So you can find a lot of recommendations there. And the new book, it will walk you through 30 conversations that are especially important in today's world, given what our kids will encounter, especially with Easter coming. I think parents will want to know that there are 2 sections, so 12 chapters just on the death and the resurrection of Jesus. It'll help you go beyond, Jesus died for my sins. Well, what does that mean exactly? What do you mean by that? Why did he have to die for my sins? Why does it matter? What did his death accomplish on the cross? And why do we have good reason to believe that he was indeed raised from the dead? So I'll answer a lot of those questions, and every chapter has a conversation guide to walk you step by step through how to do those low-grade tidying kinds of conversations.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for being on the first weekday show of Hope One. I think you've brought hope to a lot of people, hope to parents in particular. And just to sum everything up, parents, you don't have to be super mom or super dad. You can just do low-grade tidying, as Natasha said, and just move the ball forward a little bit every day and give yourself some grace. I think that's the way we ought to sum this up. What do you say, Natasha? Is that fair?
I think that's a great summary.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us, ladies and gentlemen. And Jorge, we're going to be back here tomorrow, same time, right?
11:30 Eastern. We're going to be here. You guys can go to our Facebook or to our YouTube channel, and you can select the reminder button on the show. It's going to be updated within the next couple of hours. That way you will get a reminder when we go live, and make sure that you share that publication or that post with your friends and tag people on it so they can join us on 11:30 Eastern. The more you share, the more people get this information, and we're doing it for you.
All right, folks. Thanks so much. Great seeing you all. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Jorge.
Bye, guys.